welcome to Conversations with IFS, with me, your host, Jemima Nunu. Conversations with IFS is brought to you in collaboration with GH1 TV and the Institute for Fiscal Studies. The curator for today's program is Mr. Iva Ajimandia. Let's take a quick break and then I'll introduce you to today's guest. Welcome back. My guest on today's show is a well-respected and well-known advocate. He is the founding executive director of the Institute for Democratic Governance. He is well known for his advocacy for democratic development, civic participation, and indeed local governance. He holds a PhD from the University of Stockholm in Sweden. He also is a member of the advisory board for the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Today, I have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Emmanuel Akwetey, the founding executive director of IDEG. Dr. Akwetey, welcome.
Thank you.
And I'd just like to ask you, how is it now that you're on the board of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, Regional Integration?
Well, it's my second time in any case. Okay. Yeah, yes. I did the first time, I think, between 2010 and 11. Yes, and so on. So it's for me some continuation, but it's quite a bit of work. You know, you meet to look at issues and advice, and it brings the policy world in some closer perspective.
How do you marry that with IDEG, all the work you have to do with IDEG?
Well, this is 7 countries, so you have to make time for it. And it's truly a privilege because, you know, the Foreign Ministry also works closely with the President, and they're looking at Ghana globally and so on. So you have the opportunity to advise them on how best they could handle things, and it's good. It's been good, yeah.
We know IDEG for lots of its work on democratic governance and democratic transitions, etc., etc. And recently we celebrated 25 years of democratic governance. So we often pat ourselves on the back for that, but I want to pick your thoughts. We've got 25 years of democratic governance. How has this translated into economic governance, economic management? Have we fared that well?
To a considerable extent. Our 25 years of multi-party democracy, I think it's the multi-party part of the Constitution that makes it interesting, has also been a period that we've had greater political stability and peace, relative peace. And these are vital conditions for continuous development of the economy and responding to the needs of the people, social and economic development. And in the past 25 years, if you look at the situation we were in the 70s and the 80s, we are a much stronger economy. We do not have the financial crisis of the 70s and the crisis of the 80s, which brought on economic recovery and structural adjustment programs and so on. Our growth rates have fluctuated between 3.5%, 6.5%. Occasionally we shoot higher, but we've not been able to sustain higher rates of growth, say beyond 6%. Okay, but overall, if you look at it, we are now a lower middle income economy, which is in itself a significant achievement. We've been able to see how growth has therefore increased. You know, our GDP, we are about 42 billion per annum, US dollars, you know. We've been able to reduce, work systematically in reducing poverty. We are under half of that now, and so on and so forth. So generally speaking, the stability has helped us in achieving, in stabilizing our development. But it also has had contradictions, which probably has made our achievements rather suboptimal, not at where it should be, really, because 25 years is the span of a generation, okay? 25, 30 years. And some countries have been able to do much more, transform their economy, industrialize the economy, education, health, and use the well-being of their people extremely at higher levels than one could imagine. And we are still hovering, and sometimes we are marking time, sometimes we are fluttering, but we can't fly, and so on. So I think the foundation we have built is there for us to now see how we will strengthen it to be able to soar, go to a higher level.
So how do you think we can strengthen it to soar?
I think it's a combination of factors. First of all, if you're looking at how we've managed development, you know, you can only, if you want to go higher, you should think long term and plan long-term development and execute it systematically. And one of the things we haven't done well is we've not been able to manage long-term development or development plans, implement long-term in this republic. The Vision 2020 did only 3 to 4 years. And then we went through medium term. So we've been stronger in doing medium term plans, like poverty reduction strategies or, Ghana shared growth, programs. We've been able to do IMF or World Bank programs and so on, but these are not connected to a certain long-term vision and a strategy that says we want to lift ourselves from here to that level. We should industrialize. So in 10 years, we must have agro-industry, probably should be stronger. We're processing, we're moving. We haven't seen that, but we've seen fluctuations. So the first thing, if you ask me, is that we ought to develop the capacity to systematically implement the development plans, the long-term development plans that we've put in place. The second thing is that so far politics we haven't steered or managed our politics to bring the consensus we need for long-term development. What are our priorities? Which any government elected after 4 or 8 years would come and say, well, I would approach this goal this way, but it's still the goal that we want to go to. We've seen situations where when governments come, everything changes. They want their own priorities, and it's costing us a lot. Okay, and so we need some consensus in that area. Then we have to look at our institutions. Every government comes and when you go to the civil service, the local government service, or the public services in general, the police and all that, the very people we need to deliver things for us feel so insecure. And we talk about the politicization, but you need a strong professional and competent bureaucracy to deliver development, transformational development. So these are some of the things that if we're able to fix, we will be able to achieve a lot. And probably we have to look at local government and how we open it up. The good thing about the stability is that it's giving us space. We are talking about our challenges openly, but we need solutions. And sometimes when we found the solutions we do not implement them. It takes us on average about 10 to 15 years to enact laws. Freedom, Right to Information Act is still, endorsing the anti-corruption plan. Took so long, over 10 years, almost 14 years, and so on and so forth. So how do it looks like we do not respect time in development, but things that we ought to do, we have to do quickly and be able to then build on the progress and systematically consolidate progress as we go up. We don't have that in the system.
Dr. Akwetey, don't you think there's a role for our institutions in all of this? That our institutions should be made stronger so that we can have on that continuity? Absolutely.
So the question is, how do we make them stronger? In the first place, under this current dispensation, we've created a lot of institutions. Look at the independent commissions. There are so many of them. If you take, for instance, National Commission for Civic Education, democracy requires education, civic education, and a certain culture, the civic culture, which is taught. And it's not your instincts or your how you feel intuitively, that, or on impulse, that no, you must respect each other. The debate is what brings it about. You can raise your voice in debate, but you don't attack people and forget about the issues and so on. And behavior in public and on the street. But we had a situation where we systematically underfunded, civic education. So why did we set it up? If you look at the police, where we need the rule of law, the police have been so consistently been underfunded that they do not have many things that will make them effective. And we can go on and on and on and on. So strong institutions would need competent people, would need sufficient resources, not just to pay their people, but to get the technology they need and the operational things they must do when situations are emerging. So we are not funding our institutions very well. But I think overall, it is important that we refrain from, or maybe reduce the politicization of our institutions. Strong institutions have mandates, and they must work, especially if they are state institutions, irrespective of the political color of the boss, whether they are immediate boss in an institution or ministers of the president. The police, for instance, the courts, for instance. The oath they take is to deal with all of us fairly, without taking notice of our identities, and we are citizens and we have rights. And what we found is that our culture and political ambitions, we've always tried, every government elected in this world has tried to capture, the bureaucracies, the civil service, to use it for its ends. And in the process, it's messing it up. We are recruiting people who are not so qualified into these institutions, sometimes purely on party considerations, and not through the rigorous, examinations and training and so on. And so we are messing up our institutions big time. So that for me, the issue is we recognize we need strong institutions, but our party governments are not interested in building strong institutions yet. They want to see what they can use the existing institutions for to advance their interests. But they also want to serve the nation. And in there is some contradiction. They have to decide on which comes first and build the institutions.
I know a lot of your work has revolved around civic participation,
yes,
especially the involvement in civil society and civil society organizations. How do you think that we can provide that bridge or that gap between the political class that might want to capture certain instruments of state and the ordinary citizens?
I think we will start when we successfully implement the President's vision for local government. In the State of the Nation address, it says, let's remove the prohibition against political parties participating in local elections and therefore local government. And he says he wants to, move more resources and power to the local areas for their development. And anywhere, any place that is starved of resources, money, competent people, and so on, cannot develop fast, and so on. So once that we succeed in doing that, and I hope we would resoundingly support him to achieve this goal, because if we do not amend Article 55(3) of the Constitution, political parties cannot participate in local government. And what we've done in 25 years, probably more, is that we have closed the development arena to political parties, because it's in the rural areas, in the local government areas, that the majority of the people live, where their needs ought to be addressed. The standards ought to be improved, education, health, and so on. And it is parties who organize themselves to speed up our development. They come up with programs, they listen to the needs of people and say, hey, we have a solution. If you give us the mandate within this time, we'll devote resources, our power, and we're going to solve your problems. Now, somehow, whatever the intention of taking them out of local government, we've had 30 years of that experience. This year is also the 30th year of the local government system. So it's a full generation cycle. And when you look at the situation there, we must now ask yourself, how do we improve it? We are arguing that let the parties go there. Now, if the parties are going to go there, then the first thing we're going to do is we're going to empower the citizens, because they are going to elect them. They will not be appointed by the president as candidates of patrons whom we don't see, okay? And they are not very much accountable to the people. and the people don't go to them. In fact, when people have needs in the rural communities, they go to their MPs because they voted for them. So understand the social contract they have with them. So we are hoping that, and based on our own analysis, that once we open it to parties, it's the voters who are going to elect chief executives. Okay, and if you amend the constitution, it means that your parties are also going to contest assembly elections. And they are in the local space, and they live with the people. And so first of all, enough resources, the District Assembly Common Fund hardly gets to them on time and adequately. This time, they're going to fight for it. Fortunately, the president says he wants to do that. He's willing to give more money. So now, what structures do we put in place? But that alone tells you that the people are now going to engage the parties on their development needs. And if you don't deliver it, there'll be a bit of competition, ambitions will come up. I'm looking forward to having so many young women as chief executives in the assemblies to deliver things, and probably compete with men, chief executives, assembly members in other areas, and see who is responding to the people's needs. But the people would vote those who do not deliver out.
But don't you think that could potentially deepen the already deep political polarization that we already have?
Not necessarily, because the face of the winner takes all in our system, that which has intensified the polarization, have made parties so minded about elections, is Article 55.3, the prohibition. Because you see, if you amend it now as the president wants to do, and we elect them, let's say in 4 years' time, because of so much work that has to be done before the actual election, for the first time, you're going to see that local government has all the parties, of course, in different sizes. Some will have more districts, others would have fewer, and so on. And a president they should work with. Because local government is where we implement the policies of the president. And they might have some scope. That's why we use the word devolution. They might have some scope to make certain decisions and have access to resources and respond to their peculiar problems. But we're going to get into development together. And at that local level, that is where the competition shifts. We'll be so minded in proving that we did well with girl-child education, BEC grades are better, the secondary schools are now well equipped, and so on. Those things are going to come in. It will preoccupy us so much that we'll be looking for people who are competent and qualified to do this, and how to work with the local government service. We wouldn't have time just spending all the time we have on plotting, opposing, because we must win, the presidential and parliamentary elections 4 years ahead, and we do nothing. We will find constructive ways of working with the president or ministers who may not be from our party. So it's a new dynamic of politics. And in there, you'll find out the polarization. Polarization comes from a system that does not allow people to work together, or the needs of people to be catered for generally. So that if you have a strong civil service that is not politicized, the function of the civil service is to provide needs for every Ghanaian. They see citizens. They don't see who comes from the north or south, a Ga or an Ashanti or something. They have to provide conditions that fits everybody. So you're even going to have our civil service working well, because the president instrument for governing local areas will be the civil service and the local government service. So there is a lot of positive things we must expect. Of course, it's humans who are going to work them. Our current state of quality of human resources we have, the issues of the institutions not being financed well. There's a learning process we would go through, but ultimately, in a 25-year stretch, we're going to have better results than we have now. That's my prediction. I can't prophesize, but it's a prediction.
Okay, thank you. We'll have to take a quick break now, but when we come back, we'll talk more about local governance and decentralization. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and thanks for staying tuned. Today, my guest is Dr. Emmanuel Akwetey, the Executive Director of IDEG. Dr. Akwetey, you mentioned previously about it being 30 years of our whole local governance system. And I want to ask you, how local is our local government?
Well, it is local to some extent, but needing to be more localized, if I could put it that way. If you look at where we started from 1987, 1988, where the reforms were introduced, local government has virtually collapsed. Okay, so entering the local areas, then took quite a bit of time to establish the assemblies. And you know, they did it gradually and so on and so forth. But 25 years on, we have 216 assemblies, metropolitan municipal district. In terms of government, in terms of the presence of the state, you know, it's the localization in terms of spreading it has taken place. It hasn't necessarily translated into quality governance yet, and local self-government, which is what local government is about, that the citizens have a greater say, a greater participation, and greater benefits, and so on. But what is good about it is that because we are decentralizing and creating the structures, we are also seeing infrastructure development. I mean, we are better connected now than at any time infrastructurally. Roads to the regions, to the districts, bridges, and so on. Electricity, power, and so on. And we look at schools. Now, you know, there are regional hospitals, and I'm sure that the parties will be competing soon about district hospitals, and so on, secondary schools, universities, and so on. So if you look at the picture where we were before 1993, okay, and through the years back, then we've seen the massive expansion of infrastructure development, access to education, and all that. But you would also hear that there's quite a lot of re-centralization because the wherewithal for accelerating development, the rural economies are more or less not developed. Okay, I don't even know if they count when we are calculating our growth rates annually, because we look at those factors that you would easily calculate in Accra and Cocoa and so on. But rural economies have a certain potential. Jobs can be created in many. Okay, so that if you take the president or the current government, one district, one factory, and one dam, and so on, and constituency, and so on. I think for me, what is positive about it is an attempt to put resources in the local economy, begin developing the local economy. I am not sure the right framework has been created yet in terms of the capacity of the local government service. Now, we also have a local government service, you know, to look at local things and so on. So the process of development has been going on to transform, create the infrastructure to govern, to develop, and to serve the people. But we are far from being satisfied with what has been done so far. Public service delivery, I think Afrobarometer survey findings of 2013, 14, and 15 will tell you really people are totally dissatisfied. Poorer areas are becoming poorer, although we are reducing poverty, so we have inequality, you know, spreading out of control. And these contradictions, we are not creating jobs for the youth. In 2005, we discovered that some districts have a lot of unemployed graduates. Then we started advocating, working with the Ministry of Finance, district chief executives, and so on, that there was the need for them to address this issue locally. It was that which led the late Minister of Finance, Varedo, may he rest in peace, to start working on what became the first youth employment budget, you see. And then, but in the implementation, the story became different. So enough resources are not going there. And yesterday we saw the judgment on what happened with JIDA and so on and so forth. But there had been many cases where district assemblies common fund does not go to the districts. They don't receive their funds on time. They are often not able to implement their programs on time. And, you know, other people do other things. Sometimes buildings are put up in the name of the district, but it's not part of the district's agenda, and so on. So there's been quite a bit of corruption around it, and practices that should not be tolerated. And then you also have the Auditor General's report to confirm that a lot of money meant for these areas are not going. The school buildings, the books, the teachers' welfare, and so on and so forth. So local control and responsiveness to their needs has not been that strong. And that is what we want to see tackled with the reforms we've been advocating.
How much local control do you think the Assembly should have? For example, I grew up in the UK where the councils are very strong. They determine budgets, education policy, etc., etc. So how much control or autonomy do you think that in the best case scenario our districts should have, Assembly should have?
I think it lies in the future. Act 936, which is the new local government law, is seeking to empower the assemblies a little bit more and to have autonomy in determining priorities and so on. But that also means that you have to move a lot more resources to the districts. Some districts don't just have enough money coming in. And this is one thing I learned when one of our outreaches in the north, in Tamale, a prominent chief, we were talking about financing elections and how parties go and they are giving money and bribing voters and so on. He listened carefully and he said, there's another perspective. You'll be amazed that it is only during elections that money comes into this economy. And women are able to sell food, and whatever they sell for that period of the campaigns probably is what they will do after the campaign. No money comes, and so on and so forth. So I just think that we must create the conditions now to move more resources there. You need higher economic growth to increase it over time because the needs are massive and prioritizing is really challenging. But we must ensure that support the idea that more resources ought to go. But where are the structures that would guarantee utilization of these resources to serve the people? That is where I have confidence in the people. I mean, amongst Ghanaians now, you know, when you offend them, you are not doing well, they show you the thumb. And then they also tell you, you're done. You promised us you're not delivering, you're done. But I think that that consciousness is also reflected on the pressure they put on assemblies, on the MPs. You know, because everything they need, and if you look at the needs they go to the MPs for, they are public policy needs. School fees, you know, health costs, you know, jobs they're looking for, and so on and so forth. So when they are electing their own people, proximity is very important to demanding accountability. And the politicians will feel a greater pressure of responding to the people who gave them the mandate. This time it's not going to be the faceless patrons whom nobody sees and nobody knows, but the people, the real people. And I think that I'm looking forward to that relationship and the dynamic. I think it's going to be very interesting because you need parties in to coordinate what happens in districts. They win. Yeah. You know, without the parties, it will be very difficult. You need political parties to put well-qualified people in charge of districts because you can only accelerate the rate of development and also development projects implementation if you have the people who know how to do it. Okay, and can you imagine where two MPP districts in, you know, districts side by side with the same resources coming? One is doing so well, visibly, water, you know, infrastructure, you know, schools, and so on. And another, with the same resources, is not performing. The dynamics are such that politicians will start responding to the needs of the people, and the people would also make sure it's happening. It will take time, but it will certainly happen. So that takes us to London, your local council.
But don't you think it could descend rapidly into a form of personality politics and not have the knock-on developmental goals that you said? It can be just a popularity contest.
Without the parties, then you're going to have greater risk of personality. Because you see, the initial thing is, let's elect them, no party. So what do you have? You have persons. You wouldn't even know who finances them. And you know who finances has a lot of power over the elected. It's happening. Look at our national parties. The finance.
We don't know who
we don't know them. You see, that's
them.
it. So these are the faceless people, but their priorities matter. Appointments, the priorities of what they need, the procurements and so on. So the reform would check the system. It would open door to streamlining quite a lot of things, because political parties are going to realize sooner or later that getting the national mandate would now depend on the local record performance. It's not going to be simply showing roads and you know how they do it, their green books and blue books. Now it has to impact living standards of people, real people, how they feel, how the quality of life is improving, what savings they are having, so it will be more direct and the people will speak. But it's easier for the people to keep quiet when all we show, for instance, we show the N1 and we show electricity, they are beyond them. But when you get closer, they'll tell you that, well, the schools you said you're going to build, the jobs, the water, and so on. These are things they also speak out. You can't gag everybody, you can't bribe everybody. Somebody would say, you haven't done it. So we are looking ahead to some very interesting.
But you seem to be a very strong advocate for political parties, as
yes.
they are. And just to pick your brain over...
But I don't belong to any. That's the thing.
That's not what I was going to ask you. But the current system we find ourselves is largely two-party, largely.
Yes.
How do you see, or how do you think we can open the space for the smaller parties? Because right now, there seems to be only two major choices. Yes, yes. It doesn't seem that the space is opening up.
Yes.
How do you think the space can open up so that we can have a citizen's real choice?
Okay. It's the opening of the space that Article 55.3 does when amended. That is what has closed the space to parties. Because it says political parties cannot contest in local elections. And if you can't contest local elections to elect chief executives or assembly, then you have no role there. So you can only go in informally, Nicodemously, as
a sponsor, perhaps.
But for now, when that is opened, smaller parties are going to do well for two reasons. Our bigger parties became powerful, with the exception of NDC, that was PNDC, NDC in government, and went in with some strength. But you also know that MPP caught up very quickly. Within 8 years, they were in power. And then MPP grew and became stronger. So access to government and that experience in government and the impact they have explained how these two parties have grown and become almost at par in terms of how they've split the country and their electoral fortunes. Nobody has some stable lead to remain in power for so long. Maximum 8 years you go. And then the margins sometimes are smaller, sometimes they open, but they are unstable. Okay, so if you look at that scenario, political parties in local government, the small parties, who do well, I'm sure that initially the big parties will take the districts, but with time, you'll find out that the small parties, maybe a few that they have, I'm sure they're going to work so hard to serve their people. They'll be stronger. And it's an evolution, it's a process. That's why our time perspective should be the next 25, 30 years. It starts from this year, because this year is both 25 years of democracy and 30 years of local government. Within that next span of 25 years democracy, 30 years local government, 60 and 50, you probably will not be talking about our small parties the way they are now, because they have formidable ideas. National health insurance, PNC. Okay, and there are many others, if I wish I could collect all of them, where their ideas on the table has been taken by the bigger parties and pushed without they even acknowledging where it came from. The best they do when they want to acknowledge is to say it's in the Constitution. But they have to attribute it to parties who put it in their manifestos as well. So I think that we should go into this courageously, because we know what 30 years results have been, and we are not happy with it. So we need knowledge to inspire our optimism and our ability to work harder to bring the changes. And local is so important to that.
Okay. Right now, we're going to take another break. When we come back, we'll talk more about local government and the whole idea of consensus building. Stay tuned. welcome back again. You're watching Conversations with IFS with me, your host, Jemima Nunu. Today, my guest is Dr. Emmanuel Akwetey, Executive Director for IDEG. Welcome back, Dr. Akwetey.
Thank you.
We were talking about local government, one of your and IDEG's very keen interests. And I wanted to look at fiscal management. And as we know, fiscal management has a great impact on the local government. And I just want to pick your brains as to see in what ways is that most visible? Yes.
Well, at the moment, our fiscal management is also, it's like a football in elections. You see, we agree that we would spend within our means, we would generate enough revenue, taxes, and we will balance it well with aid that comes and probably loans we take and so on. And we've found ourselves in a situation where practically after every election, the IMF and the World Bank are coming in to rescue. So there is that short period where everything we've done to control inflation, make sure that productivity is going on, our long sector is increasing and we are earning a little bit more, and we blow it all on elections. And you might think that because the votes are mobilized in the rural areas, that is, they are investing the money to persuade people that keep me in and, you know, look at what I've done for you. But then sometimes the way the expenditures go, we end up the elections, the local communities are not that satisfied. The last minute roads, you know, to various linking one district no longer impresses them. They want to see more systematic and sustained development, which doesn't happen. So they get the sense that they are being bribed and it's insulting to them and so on and so forth. Two, you also find out that after the elections, we couldn't stick to any of the targets we thought we would achieve. Usually after elections, we have high inflation. Okay, and the worst part is that after election, because we've blown the money, we stop implementing, even continuing financing the implementation of projects. So you have a whole lot of projects that are not going to be continued or do not see. Post-elections is a time that almost everything stops. The institutions don't have money to do any of the development things they want to do because they can't even pay themselves. They don't get their salaries regularly and so on. So these are problematic things. And you see that the first thing the IMF does when it comes in is to say that, hey, you have to live within your means, cut this, cut that, and so on and so forth, which also slows down our development. So I think this is something that this so-called, the economists call it the election business cycle, you know. It's something that we have to do some serious things about. I think the best solution, I like the idea of a fiscal responsibility law. I like that. But I also think that the challenges that are going to be posed to parties is for them to develop their fiscal management, fiscal policy management. They don't have that capacity now because they do not see the need to maintain the stability, okay, of the macroeconomic conditions so that you can quickly attract or even line up investors who might go into the local areas and whatever projects you have. You know, in the period that we've blown our resources on elections and our expenditures are spiraling out of control, deficit is consuming and sinking us, which investor would come? You know, and they are all afraid. And we don't deal to even create a situation for our Ghanaian private investors, okay, to access resources that will help them grow. So if you are not treating your private sector well, your own nationals and so on, and you are depriving them high interest rates, we can afford it, they can borrow and so on, why would investors come and go into those areas where, for instance, they are not the mines or oil? Most of the investment goes to extractives anyway. So we do have a very serious challenge, and I think that the law is important, but we also have to build a consensus. The consensus that says, we've practiced this for 30, 25 years. It's not serving our purpose. So what do we do? Some people say, well, if the bank is independent enough and it's effectively in charge of monetary policy, there will be enough money channeled in there, or the We heard rumors that in the past they also printed more money to spend and so on. And they don't concentrate on even mobilizing resources in terms of taxes that ought to be demanded in a certain way because they are afraid, they will not get the votes and so on. So the need for the vote and the desperate need for it has, tamed the politician, and passions, and emotions steer how we manage the economy close to elections and so on. But I believe that now both sides have learned, and probably they are working hard. I hear the finance minister and the efforts he's making, and he's saying what is not budgeted and approved, you can't spend, you can't get that money. We would put it to test as we get closer to elections and see what happens, and so on and so forth. So in the long run, this is what I think. I think that the idea that of the president to devolve power and move more resources to the local communities would work and would impact positively on the fiscal if the, we do the reforms and districts after elections are not getting their money, because according to the law, the money must go, these are estimates anyway, but they have their quarterlies, second, third, and so on. You're going to find a situation where people will go to court. Yes, now you can't go to court against the president or the minister or the district assembly common fund administrator, because by the time you get to court, they would have sacked you, but you can't sack somebody elected by the local people. And we are going to see how the law would bring some restraint, and which is why the fiscal responsibility law is important. But we need other laws. In some countries, I think Australia, Austria, a number of countries, I don't know whether Germany is part of it and so on, where 1 year to elections, you can't launch new projects. Okay, so this Junahoji road construction, or electricity supply, because of, you can't undertake that. Okay, and so it helps in restraining the politicians, addiction to spending in elections. So a number of things, agreements have to come into the system, certain rules and regulations to make it a little more difficult to spend anyhow. For the first time, you could see that when the IMF came back in 2015 under the program that is running now, there weren't much protest against the IMF because we felt helpless, that there were no controls whatsoever in the system. Our governments can do, our presidents can spend anyhow, and so on and so forth. So it's a culture, it's an attitude that has to be confronted. And I think the people's access to resources and what it means would be good, but we need more laws and regulations and its enforcement by the courts. I am hoping that we might get to a situation where the Supreme Court has said that every article in the Constitution is enforceable, is justiciable. That means that Chapter 6, the directive principles of state policy, we can take the parties to court on them for not pursuing those objectives which would improve our lives, our income, our economy, our unity, and so on and so forth. And it takes money. We have to generate more, and it must be put to that. We are fighting corruption, which is another avenue, the procurement system, procurement law that is there but is not enforced. So where is the culture of enforcement? And where are the sanctions that will go regardless? I hope that the Office of the Special Prosecutor will contribute, but ultimately, I also hope that separation of the Minister of Justice from Attorney General and a strong prosecutorial authority with funding and the courts adequately resourced, I think we can fight corruption. I'd like to see more of what happened yesterday on the JIDA issue happening more frequently across the country, so that people will know that public resources are not for taking for private ends. So this is what I think.
So Dr. Akwetey, in most of your submissions, you often talk about consensus. As we know, consensus building is not something that's particularly easy. But I want to ask you, is your ultimate goal something like, I don't know, Ghana being a proportional representation system, or what is the ultimate goal?
The ultimate goal is that in a multi-party democracy, where no one party dominates, you cannot, and you have to, there are term limits. We renew mandates every 3 years and so on. the long term you need to guarantee systematic implementation of policies that will transform the economy, okay, and grow it faster, does not exist. Ghana is not Rwanda. Ghana is not Ethiopia. Okay, Ghana is not Botswana. And Ghana is not China. It cannot be South Korea, you know, in those days when General Park was in charge. So what you have, the reality is that we have diffused power centers, okay, different parties. The two parties have dominated, but it's likely, when you look at it, we describe them as duopolies. They've almost become two monopolies in the system.
Two kingdoms.
And you see, if they had been an economic entity, they are not serving as well. Look at corruption. Corruption is what we talk about every day. And that is the product of political parties as well. If it had been the economic entities, like they privatized Vodafone, Ghana Telecom, and other things, you know, the whole sector, we started seeing MTN and others coming in, then we have to break up this duopolies, okay, to smaller parties. But we do not have the law to do that. But the point is that because no party has enough power to stay on, win elections, and so on, you need about 3 to 4 elections to effect the transformational change we are looking for, so that your policies will be implemented systematically. That is why the generation of 25, 30 years is when transformation is seen. So the Chinese 5-year development plan, which they've been pursuing for over how many years, is implemented systematically. But it's the Communist Party in power. So it goes on, and we've seen the results of how they've lifted millions out of poverty. In fact, China says by 2020 or so, it's not poor. You know, it's everybody goes into the middle income. But it doesn't happen only in situations with one party dominating political life. It's happened in Europe. You know, if you look at post-war Europe, after the devastation of the war, parties did not have the majorities. I know that in the Scandinavia, what they did was that smaller parties, one party would have a certain dominant hold, but they are parliamentary systems, but desperately needed the support of other parties and across the ideological divide. And they had 3-year term of office. Can you believe that? That was the case in Sweden. 3 years initially. Sweden from 1945 till about 1992 or something was run 3 yearly. Then it changed to 4 years. But the greatest development and transformation of the economy and the society occurred when it was 3 yearly, because they had to build coalitions.
Yeah.
And they have to accommodate parties, their ideas, not necessarily their people, but their ideas, and work with them and make everybody feel that collectively we are pursuing something systematically. So it provides the basis for continuity, that this is what we've agreed. So you would come, I would go, and vice versa. But we agreed we're going in this direction and so on. We don't have that consensus. So what happens? Today this party comes and says, oh, this was started by them. If we continue, they'll think we are doing their work. Let's go to another. And it has no scientific basis. No analysis scientifically will justify some of the things we do. But we've done that. And we don't care that some of the projects we stop. We've invested millions. I recall public sector reform when MPP took over. I think around 2003. Then the senior minister was C.J.H. Mensah, eminent, illustrious son of the country. And what happened? He laid aside the public sector reform program, where over 60 million had already been spent or more. Just coolly, it was put aside. Today, we are back talking about public sector reform, and we are looking for loans. If we had continued, couldn't we correct the mistakes? And so on and so forth. This is what we live with. And then at the end of the day, we say we don't have development. Now, because you are not going to stay in power for 8 years, 12 years, 16 years, can't we be wise enough to see how we would govern to ensure that if we go, the projects that will benefit our people will not change? And our people are demanding, you know, long-term development. Long-term development was one of the key things that citizens put forward to the CRC, the Constitutional Review Commission. And so long-term development planning is true. They said, why can't we continue the good education policies? Now we did free senior high, and before senior high, it was what? I've forgotten the systems now. There's so many. And we changed them anyhow because purely, even when experts said, don't do that, 3 years, 4 years, back to 4 years, and so on, it's messed us up. The quality of our graduates, in terms of education, the ability, analytical ability, writing ability, and so on, is problematic. Many of them, when you talk to employers, they say they are unemployable. You see, but it's part of the effect of the educational system and how we politicized the reforms. This is people's lives and what prepares them for the future, and we've messed it up. So when I talk about consensus, I am saying that in a democracy where there are different parties, and we are actually a very pluralist society from colonial times. The colonial government was never able to control the entirety of our country without some resistance or anything. And one party state couldn't, there was resistance, Rawlings couldn't, you see. So the question then is that, given that no group has all the power and there will be resistance, how do we create the settlement, the stability we need to continue certain policies that we've all agreed has to happen? And then after that, we can come back and define another one. But we are not doing that, and we are swinging the pendulum. And we are not going forward as with 25 solid years. Probably we've invested billions of dollars in this 25 years. But where we are is not, we shouldn't be proud of it. Yes, we shouldn't be.
Well, on that somber note, I would like to thank you, Dr. Akwetey, for being our guest on Conversations with IFS. Maybe in the future, I don't know, we might have an Akwetey Consensus Party being formed in the future. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching us. Tune in next week when we'll have yet another interesting conversation with another eminent guest. Have a good day. Bye.